Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. This is our final scene of Act 2, our directing identity. Scenes 1 through 4 looked at existential questions about who we are as directors and why we do what we do. Scene 5 explored our artistic taste. Scene 6 helped us unpack the nuances of power. And now in Scene 7, we're going to turn our focus inward again and explore how we can take care of ourselves as directors. I want to start with a story. Almost 10 years ago now, I was directing a production for a small theater company I had started a few years before. The exact production doesn't matter, nor does the identity of the performer this story concerns. The performer and I were working on a very emotional moment, and it was clear that they were struggling to follow their impulses and make choices in the scene. So rather than push harder, I took a time out and just had a conversation with them, asking what they were experiencing at that moment. Almost immediately, tears sprung to their eyes as they described two different experiences with two different directors in which they were actively yelled at for making a choice that the director didn't think was the right choice. Not just a single time, but multiple times throughout the period they were working together. This performer explained to me that they had learned to just let a director tell them what choices to make, and that me offering them the freedom to make choices for their character was incredibly frightening because of what had happened to them before. I wish that this were an isolated story, but unfortunately it isn't. Over the 20 years that I've been teaching and directing, the vast majority of actors, designers, stage managers, and technicians have some sort of horror story about a traumatic interaction with a director. Even directors have those stories when they have been directed by or worked with other directors. Why is this such a common story? I believe that one of the biggest culprits is the belief that the director has to hold the vision for the show, which means that most directors take on all of the pressure for the success or failure of the production. Related note, if you haven't yet, check out the flame paradigm in Act 1 for a new way to define the work of directing. Additionally, most of us never received much, if any, formal training as directors beyond perhaps assistant directing or a single directing class in college, which also may have spent little time on the work of directing beyond the artistic vision. This doesn't even account for directors in educational spaces like high schools who have to teach a full course load and are often directing, producing, technical directing, and designing shows entirely on their own or with maybe one other teacher. Essentially, being a director, especially in upstream spaces, is often like being in a race with no clearly defined finish line or knowledge of the possible routes while wearing an 80-pound backpack. It's no wonder that so many people in the world of theater, including directors, have been poorly treated by directors. So how can we minimize harm to others and ourselves in these conditions? More accurately, how do we minimize harm and still put up a fantastic show? So many of us have been conditioned to believe that the only way to make theater requires huge amounts of sacrifice and exhaustion. If we don't do it, then it won't get done. And because we and our administrators, producers, and boards of directors have also internalized the belief that since it's our vision, we bear the sole responsibility for the final product, we often feel trapped on a hamster wheel, unable to stop, but also stuck in the same behaviors over and over again. Of course, I'm talking in broad generalities. There are plenty of directors for whom I'm sure this doesn't apply. But my experience has shown me that the vast majority of us likely identify with at least some. So if the vast majority of us feel like we're stuck on this hamster wheel, like there is no other way to accomplish the production of quality theater than the way we've always done it, how do we start to address it? We start learning to take care of ourselves. Perhaps it seems impossible to dream of a way of making theater that doesn't require sleepless nights, popping antacids like candy, and or feeling like crap after yelling at the actors/designers/students/volunteers who seem hell-bent on making it even harder for us to just do our job. Often we feel that there's a tension between supporting the people involved in the project and ensuring that the project is successful. But I have learned over the past 20 years that this is a false dichotomy. It's when we take care of the people involved, including ourselves, that the project flourishes most. So we're going to explore 3 ways in which we as directors can take care of ourselves and why these techniques will lead to a stronger final product in the end. My recommendation is to pick one that resonates most with you and focus on that over your next production or two. Trying to make too many big changes all at once means that we are likely to fail at all of them, and that can be discouraging. Picking one and giving ourselves time to experiment with it and learn to implement it slowly means that we are more likely to be successful. Each of these is offered with a deep respect and encouragement to take what is helpful and leave behind what is not. So, tool number 1, understanding our own nervous system. Our nervous system is the primary communication network in our body, and it's something that the vast majority of people don't know a lot about. This is unfortunate because I think we all know the problems with not understanding communication pathways and channels in a workplace or organization, yet we live inside of our body without a clear understanding of how that body communicates with itself. The reason that this matters to directors is because once we understand how our nervous system impacts our emotional and physical states, especially in times of stress, we can learn to handle that stress in more effective ways. Most people have a broad understanding of elements of our nervous system, like our nerves, brain, and spinal cord. You might know that there are actually 2 subsystems of our nervous system that are called our somatic, or voluntary nervous system, and autonomic, or visceral nervous system. The somatic system carries sensory information to our brain and gives us control over our muscles, while the autonomic nervous system controls most of the parts of our body we don't think about, our heart rate, breathing, when we have to go to the bathroom, and more. But for most of us, that's where the understanding stops. And just like we are better able to function in a work environment when we understand how to communicate with those around us, we are better able to function as human beings when we understand more about how our body communicates. First, let's take a moment to understand the structure. I'm going to keep it as simple as possible, and it may help to imagine the nervous system like a company or organization, with our somatic system as one wing of the organization and our autonomic nervous system as the other. Today, we're going to focus on the autonomic nervous system side of the organization. There are 3 departments in our autonomic nervous system. One that gets activated when we are in danger to mobilize energy, called our sympathetic nervous system. One that helps us relax and rest, called our parasympathetic nervous system, and one that controls our digestive system, called the enteric nervous system. The sympathetic department oversees risk management. The neurons and signals that work there are always on the lookout for danger and help us get ready to handle it. This is a basic instinct we share with the vast majority, if not all, of the animals on Earth, and can lead to what we might know as our fight or flight response. The important thing to know about the sympathetic nervous system is that if it perceives danger, it uses the same few tools to help us prepare, regardless of what the danger is. You've probably felt these tools activate in situations where you feel uncomfortable or nervous, triggering our adrenal gland to produce adrenaline, stimulating our sweat glands, making it easier for us to breathe, and often increasing our rate of breathing, increasing our heart rate, and widening our pupils so that we can take in more distant visual information. So, whether we're facing down a bear in the woods or, say, a tech week we're not prepared for and are scared will go horribly, the sympathetic nervous system reacts the same. The second department is the parasympathetic nervous system, and it is in many ways the opposite of the sympathetic department. The parasympathetic system is focused on how to help the body rest and digest, or to put it more crudely, feed and breed. In this department, there's a pair of key staff members that do a bulk of the work called the vagus nerves. These are the longest nerves in our body and run directly from our brain through our neck and torso into our abdomen and pelvic regions. The vagus nerve can send signals to almost all of the organs in our body, including our heart, stomach, bladder, and colon. Similarly to the sympathetic department, the parasympathetic department has a number of tools that are employed in many situations where rest is needed, like decreasing our heart rate and respiratory rate, constricting our pupils so that we can focus on things closer to us, and more. Now, the parasympathetic department is well acquainted with the sympathetic department, and sometimes when the sympathetic department is too overwhelmed in the face of a danger or threat, then the parasympathetic system takes over and shuts things down, leading to what is often called a freeze or sometimes fawn response. The final department is the enteric nervous system, and while we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one, it is often the most under-discussed department in our autonomic nervous system because it focuses on monitoring our digestive system. But if you've ever worked someplace where there's an underappreciated department that everyone knows could run the whole company if they needed to, that's the enteric department. It's sometimes described as a second brain, with many of the same capabilities only found in our brain and spinal cord. The way the enteric system interacts with the other two departments in the autonomic nervous system is also the reason for things like the nervous poops. Okay, explanation done. Let's talk about why understanding more about this can help us take better care of ourselves. First, it gives us language to describe what we are feeling in a state of stress. Oftentimes when we are feeling really stressed, one of the hardest things to deal with is when someone asks us how they can help us or what the problem is. Accessing language in a state of stress can be difficult because the sympathetic department is doing their job and keeping our focus on preparing for the danger it sees. Sometimes instead of trying to name emotions or needs in these moments, it can be helpful to simply learn to identify what physical responses are happening. Is our heart racing or pounding? What about our breathing? Do we feel jittery or restless, which can be a sign of increased adrenaline? Are we clenching our hands, feet, or teeth? Note that none of these questions are about our emotional state. That's because the parts of our brain that allow us to experience emotion evolved after the parts of our brain controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which is a part of what you might have heard referred to as our lizard brain. Regulating our emotions is much easier to do when our physical body is not in a state of responding to danger. So once we identify the physical responses that are happening, we can address them physically as well. Which brings us to tool 2, glimmers, aka activating our vagus nerve. When we are overwhelmed and our sympathetic nervous system has been activated, trying to change our emotions can often feel like a useless endeavor. So instead of tackling the problem emotionally, sometimes we can help pull ourselves out of a high-stress state by activating our vagus nerve. Deb Dana, a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in complex trauma, coined the term glimmers in 2018 to describe this, in contrast with the idea of triggers being something that can activate our fight, flight, or fawn response. Let's review 5 glimmers here, and we'll also have a handout in the usual spot with these and more listed so that you can put them somewhere easily accessed, like your director's notebook. All right, number 1, cool down, literally. Holding something cold against your chest or the side of your neck, or even better yet, being able to splash your face or submerge your face in cold water for a few seconds helps to stimulate the vagus nerve through something called the mammalian diving reflex. As mammals, we have developed a biological reflex that when we are submerged in water, the default reaction is to activate the parasympathetic nervous system to help slow our breathing so that we don't inhale water and drown, and slow our heart rate so that we conserve oxygen. If you don't have access to cold water, it could be a Ziploc filled with ice or a bag of frozen vegetables that you hold against your chest or the side of your neck as the vagus nerve runs through both places. Number 2, massage and stretch. Specifically with gentle to moderate pressure, massaging your neck, shoulders, and feet help to stimulate the vagus nerve. The neck and shoulders because the vagus nerve runs near or through there, and the feet because of something called reflexology. You can buy equipment for this purpose, like a shoulder massager or a foot roller, but you can also just use your own hands. Stretching these areas can also be helpful, as can more general stretching, especially when paired with slow breathing, which we'll talk about in a minute. Number 3, exercise. This one might feel obvious, but exercising doesn't mean that you have to go run a mile or go to the gym. Something as simple as doing a few squats, sit-ups, push-ups, or the like can help get your blood flowing and activate your vagus nerve. Try to let go of the idea that you have to exercise for any particular amount of time or in any particular way. Even putting on upbeat music and dancing can count as exercise. As much as you can, try to focus on the exercise you're doing, but know that your mind may still be going a million miles a minute, and that's okay. Exercise can still be beneficial even when our head isn't as in it as we might like. Number 4, take an awe walk. A stress response is by its very nature focused inward. The sympathetic department of our nervous system is preparing us for danger. An awe walk, on the other hand, is an intentional time of focus outside of ourselves. It's simple and can feel silly at first, but it can be easier than what we typically think of as meditation. Instead of trying to clear your mind, something that can be very hard to do when you're in a state of high stress, an awe walk asks us to look around for the little things around us that spark wonder and awe. If we're walking outdoors, this might be things like the veins on the leaf of a plant, or thinking about how that bird singing in the trees has hollow bones to allow it to fly. Indoors, we might focus on the wonder of human innovation, looking at structural or artistic elements of our surroundings that lead to wonder. This doesn't have to be very long. Just a few minutes of intentionally searching for wonder and awe can help stimulate the vagus nerve, increasing our connectedness with the world around us and helping us get out of high stress states. And finally, glimmer number 5, slow breaths. Now, this is last on the list for a reason, and that's because it's not always as helpful as we think. You'll notice that I said slow breaths instead of deep breaths, and that's because there are 2 specific issues that can arise when doing breath work like this. First, we can get in our heads about breathing, wondering if we're doing it right or wrong, which can lead to negative self-talk and even more anxiety and stress. Second, breathing deeply but quickly, something that can happen easily if we're in a really high stress state or have a lot of anxiety at that moment, that can actually decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in our system. A fun fact about our bodies is that we can't detect the level of oxygen in our lungs, but we can detect the amount of carbon dioxide. When we hold our breath and feel that sense of anxiety and a need to breathe, it's because our body can tell that too much carbon dioxide is building up, not that we don't have enough oxygen. Likewise, if we are hyperventilating, we might start to feel like we can't breathe, but that's not because we are lacking oxygen. It's because we can tell that the CO2 levels in our lungs are lower than they should be. Breathing deeply and quickly can make that problem worse, which is why when I do focus on breathing for myself, I try to focus on slowing my breathing rather than breathing deeply. Like with all of our tools, I encourage you to take what you need and not overwhelm yourself by trying to use all of these techniques at the same time. Start with 1 or 2 that you can plan to reach for the next time you feel yourself move into fight or flight mode and see how they work. Not every tool or technique will work the same for every person, and that's okay. So let's close out this scene by exploring one more tool we can use to care for ourselves. Tool number 3, asking for what we need. Now, this may feel a bit like a duh moment, but most of us are worse at this than we realize. We might refrain from asking what we need because we don't want to be a burden to others, or because we worry that it will make us seem weak, or even because we're not entirely sure of what we need. That's why learning to understand our nervous system is important. However, we might go too far the other direction, demanding what we need rather than asking for it. And especially when we are stressed, that can often lead to raising our voice in anger or frustration. We're going to explore communication styles further in Act 3, but I want to take a moment here to talk about yelling. Yelling can be a valid form of human expression, especially in unsafe situations, like warning someone not to walk off the edge of a stage or to be careful of their hands near the circular saw. Yelling can also be meaningful when paired with a positive emotion like joy and celebration. I often find myself raising my voice when a member of my team does something incredible, whether it's actors having a great scene or a designer who really hits a home run with a design. That said, I think most of us would agree that safety issues and celebrations are in the minority of reasons we've heard yelling in our lives. Unfortunately, yelling is most often associated with anger and frustration, and this type of behavior can have deeply harmful effects on both the person doing the yelling and the person being yelled at. Many of us have complicated relationships with yelling, including being yelled at by parents or other adults as children and by superiors in the work environment. As such, it's often an unintended behavior that arises out of our own dysregulation of our nervous system when we get into that fight or flight situation. After all, one of the things we're told to do if we ever face down a bear is to make ourselves as large and loud as possible. The problem is that in our world today, the things that trigger our sympathetic nervous system aren't bears, they're fellow human beings. And as directors, they are human beings for whose well-being we are responsible for. We'll talk more about this in Act 3 and explore some tools that we can use to reduce our need to yell out of frustration or anger, and how to repair relationships that might have been damaged by yelling. All right, back to the tool. Asking for what we need means first acknowledging that as directors, we need support just the same as anyone else in the room. And we often can't bring our full creative selves to the process until those needs are met. It might mean that we need to step out of the room to find quiet and think, or take time to get food even though it means rehearsals will start late. It might mean that we need to set limits or boundaries around what we can handle in terms of when and how questions or ideas are brought forward by collaborators. We can't be our best selves when we feel shame about our support needs, and it takes a willingness to be vulnerable to ask for those needs to be met. Voicing our needs in a clear and controlled manner can also help teach others that they can express their needs to us as well, which benefits the entire environment. Regular practice is important though, because just because we ask for what we need doesn't mean that we're going to get it exactly the way we want it. And so we have to have our other tools at hand so that we can handle our disappointment, frustration, or even anger. Our feelings are valid. We just can't take them out on others any more than we want others to take out their feelings on us. So that's it. I hope that Act 2 has been a helpful dive into who you are as a director. As with all of our content, it will be here, so don't be afraid to come back and revisit portions as needed. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall. So if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. All right, I'll see you again in Act 3. Until then, my fellow storytellers, I challenge us all to be recklessly kind.